everybody, welcome to latest webinar. As you can see, I'm in a slightly different room this time, and I am stood here presenting, so in our new Zoom room. Pleased to say that today we're with Laura, and we're going to talk about how to narrow your ideal customer down to provide more sales opportunities. So people haven't logged in to listen to me, so I'll hand it over to you, Laura, and obviously people have got any questions have gone along, put them in the chat box, put it in the Q&A, whatever you might need to do, and I'll kind of field them with Laura as we go along, if that's okay.
Yeah,
over to you,
great.
Laura.
Thank you. As we go through this, as I did last time, I've tried to put in some natural breaks, so anything that comes up, I'll just double check in with you when that happens, Mike. So I'm just going to share my screen. This is the, there we go, presentation for today. So as Mike rightly said, what we're going to go through today is how to narrow your ideal customer down to provide more sales opportunities. The premise of this, essentially, what you find is that with marketing, it's very easy to get lost in the kind of activity without thinking about actually who you need to be in front of to make that activity the most effective it can be. So what I've tried to break down is exactly why this is important. So this quote kind of covers what I'm trying to get at. So storytelling is fine as long as you can encourage people to act on your stories. There's absolutely no point putting a message out there if nobody's listening and nobody kind of engages with it, because either it doesn't resonate with them or it doesn't play to their needs. So with this, what we're going to break down is the following. So we're going to look at what actually a target audience is. Without having the foundations, the building falls over. So without truly understanding what it means to have a target audience and what that looks like, you're not going to be able to realistically pin down exactly who yours is. We're then going to talk about research. So actually, how do you figure out who that looks like for you? What kind of things do you need to look at, factor in, all of that side of things? We're then going to actually look at how you define your own target audience. There's a couple of tips and tricks in here. Once we've got that, the next bit is to build more sales opportunities. So what we need to think about is, now you've got your audience, how are you actually going to reach them? And then how are you going to engage with them to get the result out of the process that you need to in your business? So the first thing we're going to talk about is what actually is a target audience. So a target audience definition from Sprout Social. If you are curious about anything to do with social and also marketing in general, Sprout Social is a really great resource to use. Their definition: a target audience is a group of people defined by certain demographics and behavior. Often businesses use what they know about their target audience to create personas, and these personas guide their decisions on marketing campaigns. What this definition is really good at doing is showcasing the process that you actually need to think about. What you don't want to do is go in with a marketing kind of idea or campaign or initiative and then try and shoehorn your audience into that idea. What you need is that your target audience, and I bang on about this all the time, your target audience is center to your activity. So once you know who your target audience is, then think about how they behave and what they need to hear from a marketing perspective to make your campaign, your initiative, the use of the tool as effective as possible. So how do we do this? So building a persona, so understanding the person behind your target audience. There's three key things which I will break down further after this kind of section, which we want to think about. So the first thing is demographics. This is something that I advocate not actually focusing on for too long. It's very easy to get kind of overwhelmed and inundated by thoughts about the characteristics, shall we say, of your person, your target audience, like your gender, your age, profession, location, marital status. That's great because, you know, when it comes to things like Facebook ads, you can target those people based on their demographics, which makes things a lot more effective. However, that doesn't really give you any inclination as to how they're going to behave, how you need to interact with them. So it's definitely worth knowing if it's relevant, these pieces of information. So for example, what you might find is that your demographic is a small business owner that lives in Yorkshire. They work within a certain sector, so say manufacturing. That's great, because what you've got there are some flags, some indicators to who might be the right type of person for you. So what you've essentially done is go from having this really big kind of pool of audience, and you've fine-tuned it and reduced that pool by some of their demographic features, because they are flags for you to know that they're the right audience for your business. But it kind of doesn't stop there. What you don't want is that your pool is too big, because when your pool is too big, your message can get diluted, and and you kind of, essentially, the more specific you can be, it's not niching, it's the more specific you can be, the more effective your message can then be to communicate to that person. What you want to think about is that relationship and engagement. Even though on the kind of objectives process, that's the very last part, it's kind of that underlying theme is how actually are you going to engage with these people? And that comes down to the next 2 points, which is your got and want list. A got and want list is essentially, who are your current customers? What current clients do you have? And what of those clients would you like more of? Whether that's as an engagement, whether that's as the kind of way you work with each other, the way you interact with each other, the way you found each other. It's thinking, right, in my mind, I know that I have this kind of list of demographics to work from, but also think about your current situation anyway. What have you got already? And what would you like more of? Versus what gaps do you want to fill? So if there is a type of relationship that's not there, or a type of kind of lead generating tool that you're not using, so that's formed that relationship, what gaps do you want to plug? Once you've thought about that, you then need to get into the behavior. There's a lot of theory on consumer behavior, a lot of reading. If anybody wants any signposting to some really good articles and kind of blogs and things like that, let me know. Consumer behavior is what it says on the tin. It's how your consumers behave. And if you can understand actually things like motivation, why they're buying. So is it they're buying as a habit? Is it they're buying as a treat? What's the kind of motivation and behavior behind their engagement with you? That is a lot more about the relationship you can build. So what you're doing there, instead of thinking about the characteristics of the person, you're thinking, actually, how do they act, and how do I need to act with them in order to get them into my pipeline? So a couple of things that you can consider. I mean, I've talked about this in the last webinar I did, which was about the kind of message you need to communicate. Essentially, you need to think about what their problems are. What is it they're struggling? What is it they need or want? What gap do they need filling in their life? And then thinking about, how are they interacting with other people? Have they interacted with other people that do the same thing as you before? Are they in a business setting? Are they in a consumer-based environment? What do they do on a day-to-day kind of basis that means that they need your interaction as part of their daily life? So when you're building your persona, think about your demographics first to bring that audience in. Then think about and reflect on what you've got and what you want. And then think about, with this kind of narrowed down audience, what's their behavior? What key markers are there of how people behave that you can use to target people more effectively? A little bit more into this, there are some slightly more deeper factors building on what I've just kind of gone through. So when you're thinking about that consumer behavior, there are 3 key factors. The first one is personal. Their interests and opinions that are affected by the demographics. So once you've brought that zone in, it's thinking, right, what are they talking about? What are they feeling? How are they, are they tweeting rants? Are they really engaged in football? Are they political? Where do their alliances lie with interests? Are they music people? You've brought that demographic down, you can then make that more specific by understanding their personal factors. Then what you think about is their psychological factors, so perceptions and attitudes. What do they think and feel, essentially? And then what you then do is think about social factors. So what relationships are they part of, which is what I was talking about earlier with things like networking communities, or are they with it, do they volunteer in the public sector? Are they educated and to what level? Where are their kind of, if they are educated to university level, for example, what did they study? What are they interested in? What did they write their dissertation on? Thinking about as well what social media they use, not from a, right, I need to be on that social media account, but more about how do they engage with other people. It's more about those relationships that they're making. So when you're thinking about consumer behavior, if you can break down some of their interests and opinions, some of their attitudes and feelings, and then also how they're kind of building relationships and being part of society, just gives you a really solid understanding of exactly who that person is and how you need to interact with them.
Laura, do you think this is why questioning you and getting feedback from your current customers is so important? Because what you might think the reason they deal with you is, it might be something else. So
Yeah.
being able to ask those questions and not be afraid to put it out there is so important to then reflect, obviously, with future customers.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the first things that I get customers to do with me is to understand customer perceptions. So it's not just about gathering feedback on the level of service, it's more about understanding what they think you stand for, what they think your values are, why they think you're better than competitors. If you can kind of understand their perceptions, it plays to this psychological factor here. You understand exactly how they feel about your brand, and what you can then do is use that information to talk to other people who act in the same way as them. Does that make sense, Mike?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's one of those that, and I think it's very useful to work with someone else on this, because again, your perception. I read something recently about how difficult it is to see a piece of art if you've got your face pressed up against the work itself. Sometimes you need that step back, and working with somebody else just to help you do that can be really important. And obviously, part of that is that feedback from your customers.
Yeah, absolutely. And it doesn't need to be anything complicated. I mean, I get my customers to send 4 questions. And it's a completely separate exercise to gathering feedback from a review perspective. It's more about just those 4 questions so that it's not overly complicated, but you do just get that solid understanding, and it forces you to take a step back. It's very easy, as I'm sure you can imagine, to get stuck in the doing zone when you're in your business, and you get kind of, you think it's going a certain way, whereas actually sometimes you need that outside perspective, and whose perspective is better than your customers, to show you how you can engage with people moving forward. So are there any questions or anything there, Mike, before I move on to research?
I think that's fine for now, Laura. Obviously, I'll let you know when the questions come in.
Great. So the next step of this is exactly what Mike's just said. So it's all about research. Now, in this, there are 4 things essentially that you want to be looking at. The main thing of this is the title of this slide. You need to listen. So what you're wanting to do here is exactly what Mike's just said. You step back, step out of the situation and observe. So there are 4 things that you want to be observing. The first one is competitors. So what you want to do is a little bit of research on who your competitors are, how they're interacting with their audience, and kind of what kind of things they're saying. Now, the main reason for doing this is to really understand the level of opportunity that you have to target and to play on. So in doing this, if anybody wants any insight into specifically what you want to say, feel free to let me know. But there are 3 core things when you're looking at competitors to look at. And what I always say is, with this, as you're doing it, if you find yourself comparing yourself to them, you need to stop doing it, do something else, and go back to it later. Because this is not about, how, you're maybe missing out on an opportunity because they're doing something that you're not. It's not about that. What it's purely and simply about is understanding what potential there is. So what the three things: their turnover, if you can get access to that information, to understand literally what opportunity, what kind of profitability there is that you can tap into, which is essentially customers spending their money elsewhere. So understanding the turnover. The kind of second one is their core marketing message. And the best way to do this is by looking at the headline of their website. So when you get onto their website, if they haven't got a website, look at the bios on social media. It's about what are they saying that they do and how are they communicating that message. The third thing is to have a look at collectively what social media following they have. As I mentioned on the previous section about consumer behavior, how people interact with social media is key. And if you can have a look at where their audience are, so what platforms they're using and being followed on, and how their audience are interacting with them, then what it gives you a really solid picture of is where your audience are spending their time other than with you. So where your target audience is spending their time. It's really important to do this to understand your position within the wider industry. And like I said before, it's not about the fact that you're not doing something that your competitors are. It's about what potential there is that you can tap into before you understand who your audience are. Because until you understand where you are in the industry, there's no real context there, and it can kind of feel like you're floating in midair without any real kind of foot on the ground. So competitor research is the first thing to look at.
Laura, just there's a question before you go on to the next bit, if that's all right. So Imran's asked, I guess it's kind of a follow-on from the question I asked a few minutes ago about how, I know you kind of touching on it here, how to market research when you're just starting out or even haven't started out yet. So kind of what the type of thing, because obviously that is slightly different. You can't ask your customers because you don't have any at that stage.
No. So there's a few different things you can do when it comes to market research. Essentially, what you need to find is the best kind of tool to use for you. So examples of market research, depending on the sector, you've got focus groups. Now, regardless of how kind of soon you are into business development, I guarantee you've got a network of people who will get into a room with you and tell you their thoughts. So there's focus groups, there's interviews. You can kind of do a one-to-one interview. You can do questionnaires. You can do the other kind of research which people don't think is market research so much is what in academic kind of land would be literature reviews. So looking at what literature and publications are out there already and pooling the kind of resources from them. So I think, and another kind of example is beta testing. Now that only really works in certain industries. So software is a great example. Gaming constantly use alpha and beta testing. That is essentially where you've already got a product and you test it with an audience. The main thing with any form of research is that you need to be impartial. So you need to make sure from an ethics point of view, more than anything, that you're not guiding people down a path. So it's more about, right, let's create some questions which are very open questions. It's about discussion, and you essentially sit back and, exactly as this slide says, listen. You're not prompting people to give you a certain response because that's the response you want to hear. If you're wanting to do market research, feel free to get in touch with me. There are certain things that you might have to consider that you've not considered before. If you want it to be a reputable kind of, essentially you're doing a study. So if you want it to be a reputable study, there are things like consent forms that you might need to consider. But there are different types depending on your industry. So it's definitely worth exploring in a bit more detail. Does that answer the question, do you think, Mike?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question, Imran. And I think, so what the I'd advise looking at, so it's kind of finding out a bit about how Dropbox did when they started their business. So essentially, long story short, they actually advertised their product at the halftime of the Super Bowl a few years ago before they'd even actually built it. Mm-hmm. And the idea was they got all this, firstly, kind of from a marketing point of view, they got lots of interest, but they also then started speaking to the people who were interested about what they wanted, how they wanted it, and changed the product hundreds, if not thousands of times before they'd even launched it. It's probably the best example I've known of that type of research. I appreciate that's on a bigger scale, but the basics of it still apply for any business.
Absolutely. And like you say, the main thing that they did was prompt response, and they just sat back and listened. So yeah, I think market research is an absolutely great thing to do, especially when you've not got a product yet, because you can really understand exactly what your consumers need before spending money, investing time, all of that stuff on something actually that's not what they need. So there are a variety of different ways to do it. I think it's about thinking about who your audience is and what your idea of a product is or service, and then using the most appropriate type of research, whether that's questionnaire, focus group, interview, literature review, for your business. So the next thing we have already kind of talked about is customer perceptions. So it's understanding what your customers feel about your current business. If you haven't got a business, it's about thinking about what your network think of you as a business person, think of your values, blah, blah, blah. So there are 4 questions. Again, if you want me to send these to you, let me know. The 4 questions that I get everybody to ask all around, essentially, what do we do / specialise in? What makes us competitive or different to our competitors? What are our brand values? And 3 keywords or phrases that best describe us. What that gives you a really solid picture of is what your brand stands for and what people find valuable in what you do, which allows you to really filter down how you communicate. So that is something else you need to consider. The next thing is the bulk of the last webinar I did. So it's your brand story. So what message essentially do you need to communicate to get across to your audience and resonate with your audience? It's not, this is how my brand started, this is our journey. That, to be honest, is not important to your customers. It's important to you, and absolutely you want to talk about it at the right time. But this is not what I mean by brand story. So your brand story, again, I'll just kind of mention it again. There's a book called Building a Story Brand by Donald Miller. It's a great book, and essentially it uses a framework of a story. So you have a character, that character comes into a problem, they meet a guide that helps them through that problem, and it all ends happily ever after. Essentially, your character is the customer that you're kind of trying to get in front of. You are the guide, and the framework is all about understanding what your customer needs, what your character needs, so that you can kind of position yourself as the person helping them with what they need, rather than talking about your services. What you need to show is the difference you can make to a customer's life. And that's where your brand story comes in. So essentially what you need to do is listen to and pull out what your customers have said in the past that they need, what kind of problems you're coming up against regularly, what things people are talking about on a regular basis. So for me, it would be people that are using social media and not really getting anything from it, or they're spending loads of time on planning content and it's not doing anything for them. They're not getting the level of engagement they need, or, you know, they have a website that doesn't get any traffic. It's all of those kind of things that you think, what are the problems? What does that manifest as from a feeling point of view? So how are they feeling as a person? And what you need to think about is how you're communicating that message across to your potential prospects. So that's something else you need to kind of listen to and kind of gather. And then the final thing is data. There are other people out there doing what you do. It might not be the same thing as what you're doing, but it could be very similar. And there's always industry data. There's always industry data. There's always, you can get feedback from competitors. You can use things like answerthepublic.com, which is a really great resource to listen to literally what people are searching, what people need help with. There are other resources like that that you can look at to get an idea of what people need from a data perspective, but also from a qualitative perspective, so words. And if you can kind of pool all of those four things together, so you've got an understanding of your position within the industry, you understand what your current customers and network think of your brand, you know exactly what message you need to communicate because you've listened to the needs and wants of your customers, and also you've got the current data that's out there around what you do. If you can gather all of that information, you've got a really solid picture of exactly kind of what you need to, how you need to engage with your audience and who that audience is more specifically. So before we move on to this next step, are there any questions or anything, Mike?
No, that's okay. That's everything for now. Thank you, Laura. That's good.
Great. So once you've got that information, the next step is to actually physically define who your audience is. What you've done is you've gathered all the context that you could possibly gather. What we need to do now is make that circle even smaller, so it's very much defined per your business. So this is as simple as it needs to be. It doesn't need to be any more complicated than these three things. So you will have in fact, before I go into that, what this is really important is anybody who says that they target everybody, this is where actually you need to stop saying that and be specific into these three categories. Because actually, if you've done the steps previous, you will absolutely know that you don't target everybody. You might like to target everybody, but that's not realistically possible in the time that you have as a small business owner trying to communicate with an audience. So what we want to break down are these three categories. So your primary target audience, your secondary target audience, and your tertiary, third level. Primary target audience are the people who the bulk of your marketing messages will appeal to. So it's those people who have maybe got the highest spend capacity. They maybe have, well, they're the people who will engage in the bulk of your activity. So as well as paying you for your services or wanting to pay you for your services, they are engaging in other things that you're doing. So watching a webinar that you present on, they might be, engaging in, they might come to an event you host, they may nominate you for awards. They're the people who are really invested in you as a business. And what you want to look for when you're trying to find new ones is more of those people. Your secondary, the message that you communicate to your primary audience will probably appeal to your secondary audience as well. But what you might find is that those secondary audiences may not engage with you as much as your primary. So your secondary audience, it might be that actually they only pay you for your core service and they don't really engage with the extra things you're doing. Or they only, if you offer more than one product, they might only be actively purchasing one of them or wanting to actively purchase one of them. That could also be established by industry. So it might be that you have, thinking back to the demographics and their attitudes around those, it might be that actually it's location factored, it might be that it's industry factored, but there's a reason that they're not engaging with you as highly as the primary audience. So what you want to have essentially between these two people is the majority of your time is spent trying to appeal to your primary audience. Your secondary audience is kind of a bonus, and maybe some of your targeted messages are aimed at them. The third level is more about people who need to know what's going on in your business, but aren't actively buying from you. So think of this as referral partners, people in your network. They absolutely need to know what you've got going on because they need to know that so that they can refer people your way. So if you think of if, for example, you get a lot of referrals from a business coach, if you don't actively speak to that business coach, they might not know that you've got this webinar coming up. So they might not actively help you fill those ticket slots. If they don't know that you've offered a new service, they might not know to keep an ear to the ground to help you find people that service is appropriate for. So you need to keep in touch with these people and maintain the relationship there, engage with them. But your marketing messages and your marketing activity isn't driven by them. It's more of a nice to have. So to give some context to this, it might be that you spend your time on things like social media, advertising, you run events for your primary and secondary audience. Your tertiary audience, your referral partners, they are people who you have one-to-ones with on a regular basis and you have catch-ups with and grab a coffee with, because it's more about that relationship over a long period of time. So it's just one thing to consider that we will go into in more depth shortly is that you will naturally engage with these people in a slightly different way. But if you can break it down into who's your primary, who's your secondary, and who's that third level, then you know exactly, based on all the research and kind of development you've done previous to this, you know exactly who you need to communicate to. So you've kind of ticked that box of how do you reach your audience? We're going to go more specifically into the physical how after this. But I hope that gives a good kind of picture of how to break that down. Is that okay, Mike? Any questions?
No, that's good, Laura. Thank you. It's good.
So the next bit, how to reach your audience. So you figured out exactly who they are. What we need to think about now is the sales side of things. So how do you actually get them into your pipeline? So essentially, it's how can you get right in front of these people using the knowledge and research that you've gathered on exactly who these people are and how they behave. So there's a few things here on how you can target people, and this let me just move myself out of the way. These are a couple of things that are maybe platform specific, a couple of things from an actual marketing perspective. But the very first thing that you need to think about is going back to that kind of beginning. How are they behaving? So where are they hanging out? So if, for example, you target tradesmen, where are those tradesmen? They might seem a little bit elusive. They've all got pals. They work on a very word of mouth basis. So is it that actually you need to start building your connection of network in the trade sector rather than thinking, okay, I need to target them on Facebook? So what it's about thinking is you understand how they're behaving. So where, based on that, do they spend their time? Because where they spend their time is where you need to then spend your time to get in front of them. Some other things more kind of technologically that you can use, hashtags. Hashtags people can follow, especially on LinkedIn and Instagram. And people will follow hashtags that are relevant to their interests. So they might follow one that's leads business, or they might follow one that is about sustainable shopping. You know, there are loads and loads, millions of hashtags out there. What you want to think about is based on their influences, attitudes, what are they potentially following as a hashtag? Can you use that hashtag in your content, making sure it's relevant to what you're talking about, to physically get in front of the people who are following that hashtag? Another thing you can do is use the location tags. We've mentioned demographics. If you know that your audience hangs out in Sheffield, then use the location tag Sheffield on Instagram or Twitter. Other things are thinking around who else, thinking about that third factor within consumer behavior, the kind of more relationship oriented factor. They will probably follow people of influence. So people who, not just your stereotypical influencers on Instagram, it's thinking, right, who do they look to for information, inspiration? Who do they just like following? So it might be that they like following, I don't know, what's his name? Lad Baby, is it the guy that does the Sausage Roll Christmas song? Because they find him really funny. And that is, if you're engaging with that person and you're even maybe collaborating with that person, you're much more likely to reach the audience that they influence. Have you got a question, Mike?
No, I think that's a really good point. So I was on a webinar last week with Daniel Priestley, who some people might have read various books they had, Key Person of Influence and other things like that. And from that, I've had 3 people, 3 leads from that, for people who are also on the same thing as me. Essentially, because we've got the same, because we follow the same person, we've got similar interests, and it just came from that. So that was a good example of what you were saying there, of following those people of influence, being in their sphere can be really, really useful.
Absolutely. And if you can collaborate with them, it's even better, because what that does is it elevates you from another kind of follower to a person of influence yourself. It's that very much that expertise kind of mindset. If you hang out with people that other people consider experts, and you know that the people that consider them an expert need your services or might want your services, then you're automatically elevating your level of influence within that audience. So kind of got to be a bit savvy about it. It's about hanging out with those people, having conversations in those spheres. Facebook groups are really good for that, because you've got groups that are based on interests. So if you can hang out in those spaces, talk and engage with those spaces, but then also collaborate with the people of influence in those spheres, absolutely, you're going to elevate your profile, and that's where leads come in. You're absolutely right, Mike. Again, thinking about analytics, data. So for example, Google Analytics, you can look at things like Google Search Console to see what people are searching. You can have a look at generally just how people are interacting with your website or your Facebook page, what else they're interested in, so that you can then get into the kind of influential spaces. There's a lot of, it's kind of scary how much data there is that you can use, but there's a lot of it there. And if you have access to it, you might as well use it. Side note, if anybody does start delving into it and they get a little bit confused about things like Facebook analytics, drop me a message. I'm happy to explain things. Because it is an absolute kind of minefield of stuff. But yeah, so having a look at the actual data behind these scenes will then help you kind of signpost yourself into the spheres of influence. Sounds like a book title. And then the other thing, which we've already said, is it's really important to be part of the conversation. If you're hanging out in these places, but you're quiet, nobody's going to hear you. So what you need to do is actually influence the scene yourself. So be part of that conversation, introduce yourself to people. It would be like walking into a networking group and standing in a corner. It's not going to work. So think of these places, whether it's a hashtag that you're using, any of it, make sure that you're actually talking to people and having influence. Essentially, that's what it's about. So what you've got essentially with up to this stage, you've really found kind of the sphere of your target audience. You understand exactly how they're behaving. You kind of know what factors to look out for and raise the flag at. You can break down the 3 key audiences, and for each of those audiences, you can start targeting based on a few of these things and getting in front of them. So the next bit is then about engaging. This is the kind of final point really from me. Once you've got into the room with these people, it is imperative that you actually speak to them. And there are various ways that you can speak to them. You can be really direct. You can create resources and share resources. You can engage literally just in conversation threads, forums. It's what I've just said. It's really important that now that you're in front of this audience and you've really clearly defined who they are, where they are, it's then time to speak to them. If obviously you're not sure how to do that, use some of your market research. Look at how your competitors are speaking to your audience and think, right, is there something they're doing that I like? Is there something they're doing that I'm not too sure of? And build your own kind of test and try it out. It's always going to be about trial and error to start with, trying to speak to these people and fine-tuning your methods as you do so. So that is everything. Very quick whistle stop of how to narrow your audience and then engage with them. Any questions, Mike?
Yeah, I was going to ask about the kind of engaging piece. Obviously, there's a lot of people out there you could potentially engage with. My experience of it is the importance of being persistent, without being too over the top, but don't lose heart with it. Start conversations. People won't always come back to you, but over time, it will just happen. So that was kind of just my experience more than anything else. Would you agree with that?
I would, definitely. And I think there's a difference between communicating with them and engaging with them and trying to sell to them as well. You will never really have much success if the first engagement you have with someone is to pitch to them. So it's really important. The whole kind of premise of this, I hope that has come across, is it's about relationships. And that's where you're absolutely right, Mike. The persistence in not being annoying, but just kind of checking in with people regularly and engaging with them regularly. Eventually, you will then converse. They'll come back to you because they think of something that you've mentioned before, or they might think, actually, you're on the nose there. Let's have a chat about this further. And that will just naturally help build that relationship. So yeah, you're right. Persistence, but not from a sales kind of perspective.
Yes, of course. Yeah, it's more just consistency, probably a better word than persistence, actually.
Yeah.
So Imran's asked another question, which is great. So he's asked about how potentially he could differentiate his primary, secondary, and tertiary market in the fitness industry. So he's building a AI-powered fitness app.
Okay.
So now, have you got any kind of tips and recommendations on how he could differentiate between his primary, secondary, and tertiaries?
Yeah. So the easiest place probably to start with is tertiary. They are people in your sphere who you might collaborate with, who you might refer to you. So they're people maybe in the fitness scene. It could be nutritionists, it could be dietitians, it could be life coaches. They're people who naturally it comes up in their conversation, things that you're talking about, and they might have people to direct to you because of conversation. So the first thing I would think about is who's in that sphere. When it comes to primary and secondary, it's just about thinking about that behavior. So why is it people need, what's at the core of your product that people need? And then thinking, right, well, who is this based on the research that you've done? Who exactly is going to use this religiously? Versus who is maybe going to dip in and out. They might not be as consistent. And thinking about the three levels, so the demographics and how that influences their interests and behavior. Think about if there's, for example, it might be that you're targeting at demographics wise women aged 35 to 50, for example, but actually the characteristic is that they have gone through some form of change, which means that their attitude and things that they're interested in is changing. And it's having those conversations. So thinking, while you've not yet got your product, who is at the core of your kind of why you've created it, versus who is less invested in what you've created. I hope that makes sense.
Oh, absolutely. And Imran's had a follow-up question, actually, which is kind of going back to the market research element of things. How would you suggest you kind of find target customers to interview in the customer discovery process? It's found that people are generally kind of unwilling to talk really without some sort of incentive. You mentioned here about gift cards and things like that. I guess my experience of this is how you frame it is important, and who you're talking to as well. And obviously, if you want to take that up, Laura.
Yeah, absolutely. You'll find that the people who are asking for an incentive are probably not your target audience. What you want to do is ask people, and it might be that to start with, while you're at the very beginning stage of this, that you do your market research with people in your third level. So people who you've already got relationships with, and then build up to, once you've got some research already, you've maybe got some data behind what you're trying to communicate and so on. You kind of use that initial type of research that you've got with people who you've already got that relationship with to then bring in the primary and secondary audiences. I personally don't think you should incentivize market research kind of questions ethics, really, as to why people are taking part. And what you want as a business owner is the most truthful and valid, unbiased research responses. So realistically, if people are asking you for an incentive, they're probably not invested enough in what you're talking about. So maybe you need to spend either a little bit more time building that relationship, or thinking about people who you've already got a relationship with as that first kind of tier in the ladder.
Yeah, so I guess, Laura, you'd be better getting 5 genuine, honest responses than 500 people who are just doing it for a bit.
For the sake of doing it. Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely.
that makes sense.
Yeah.
Thank you for the questions, Imran. That's great, and hopefully that's answered your question. I have seen your point about sending the recording, which I will do after this. So thank you for that. Don't think we've got any more questions, Laura. I think that's it. Unless there's anything else you wanted to add on top of that.
I don't think so. I think obviously if anybody wants to have a more specific conversation about their situation with this, drop me a message. My details are on the Northern Affinity website. And yeah, watch it back, work through it step by step, rather than kind of trying to do it all in one go. So start with the first step, then move on to the second. But it's just a really useful exercise to make your messages more effective and efficient. So yeah, any questions, just drop me a message. Otherwise, no, there's not really anything for me to add, Mike.
Thank you. And Imran's asked if we can connect with you on LinkedIn, Laura, so I'll send those details through if you're all right with that. So I'll get that to Imran. Obviously, Laura's mentioned a couple of times the previous webinar that she's done as well, so that's available as well. So that's both on our website and on the YouTube channel as well. So I'll send those details through. But finally, thank you, Laura. Thank you so much for your time. You answered quite a few questions there, which is brilliant. Thank you for everyone who's come along. Last one before Christmas. So if I don't speak to both yourself, Laura, and everyone on the call, have a great Christmas, and yeah, we'll see you all in your new year.
Great. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you, Laura.